What happens when time runs out for the oldest inmates on death row? In this video, we're uncovering the chilling stories of the oldest criminals ever executed in the U.S., their shocking crimes, the decades they spent waiting for their fate, and the eerie details of their final moments. From their last meals to their haunting final words, we're taking you inside death row like never before. Starting with the oldest of them all, Walter Moody. On December 16, 1989, a deadly package arrived at the home of 11th Circuit Court Judge Robert S. Vance in Mountain Brook, Alabama. When he opened the package, a powerful homemade bomb exploded, killing him instantly and seriously injuring his wife. Just 2 days later, another bomb was discovered at the NAACP offices in Jacksonville, Florida, but was safely defused. The man behind these deadly attacks was Walter Leroy Moody, Jr., an aging extremist with a long history of legal battles. Moody had spent years harboring resentment toward the justice system after being convicted of a 1972 bombing that left a woman injured. Believing the courts had wronged him, he sought revenge by sending mail bombs to federal judges and civil rights offices. Authorities launched a nationwide investigation, and in 1991, Moody was convicted on 70 federal charges, including the murder of Judge Vance. He was sentenced to 7 life terms plus 400 years in federal prison. But his legal troubles didn't end there. Alabama also sentenced him to death for the judge's murder. For more than 25 years, Moody fought his execution, filing numerous appeals, but none succeeded. On April 19, 2018, at the age of 83, Walter Moody was executed by lethal injection at the Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama, making him the oldest person ever executed in modern U.S. history. Before his execution, Moody refused to make a final statement and showed no emotion as the lethal drugs were administered. He was pronounced dead at 8:42 p.m. Bigler Job Stauffer II. Bigler Job Stauffer II, more commonly known as Bud, was executed at the age of 79, making him one of the oldest people ever put to death in the United States. His story is one of cold-blooded murder, decades of legal battles, and a final moment where he maintained his innocence until the very end. The crime that put Stauffer on Oklahoma's death row happened on January 24, 1985. That day, he entered the home of Linda Reeves, a schoolteacher, and her boyfriend, Doug Ivins. Linda was a kind-hearted woman who had dedicated her life to helping young children, while Doug was a local businessman. But their ordinary lives took a tragic turn when Stauffer arrived with a gun. Investigators say that Stauffer had borrowed the weapon from a friend, claiming he needed it for protection. Instead, he used it to commit a brutal attack. Inside Linda's home, he shot her twice in the head at point-blank range, killing her instantly. He then turned the gun on Doug, shooting him in the face and shoulder, leaving him critically wounded. After the attack, Stauffer staged the scene to look like a murder-suicide, hoping to escape justice. But there was one problem: Doug survived. Despite being severely injured, Doug managed to identify Stauffer as the shooter, leading to his immediate arrest. Prosecutors argued that Stauffer killed Linda and tried to kill Doug in an attempt to gain favor with another woman he was dating at the time, who allegedly wanted Linda dead. At trial, the evidence against Stauffer was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the gun to the crime, and Doug's eyewitness testimony sealed the case. In 1985, he was convicted of first-degree murder and shooting with intent to kill and sentenced to death. But Stauffer refused to accept his fate. For more than 35 years, he fought his conviction, filing countless appeals and claiming he was innocent. His legal team argued that his trial was unfair and that new forensic evidence should exonerate him. But time and time again, the courts upheld his death sentence. As his execution date approached, Stauffer became part of a controversial legal battle over Oklahoma's lethal injection protocol. He and his lawyers argued that the state's 3-drug execution method was cruel and inhumane, pointing to a previous execution where the inmate reportedly convulsed and struggled before dying. Despite the concerns, Oklahoma moved forward with Stauffer's execution. On the morning of December 9, 2021, Bigler Stauffer was strapped to the gurney at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Witnesses say he remained calm, showing no fear in his final moments. When asked for his last words, he refused to admit guilt, instead stating, "My request is that my Father forgive them. Thank you." At 10:16 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Carl Wayne Bunchen. Carl Wayne Bunchen, a career criminal with a violent past, was 78 years old when he was executed, making him the oldest person ever put to death in Texas. But despite his age and decades behind bars, the state refused to forget the brutal murder that put him on death row. On June 27, 1990, Houston police officer James Irby pulled over a vehicle for a routine traffic stop. Inside was Bunchen, a hardened felon out on parole. Without warning, Bunchen stepped out and shot Officer Irby in the forehead, then fired 2 more shots into his back as he collapsed. He then turned his gun on Irby's partner before fleeing the scene, only to be caught hours later. In 1991, Bunchen was sentenced to death, but through decades of appeals and legal delays, he managed to avoid execution for over 30 years. By the time his final day came, he was a frail old man in a wheelchair, arguing that his execution was unnecessary. The courts didn't agree. On April 21, 2022, Bunchen ate his last meal: double bacon cheeseburger, deep dish apple pie, and vanilla bean ice cream. Strapped to the gurney, he gave his final words. "I wanted the Irby family to know one thing. I do have remorse for what I did. I pray to God that they get the closure for me killing their father and Ms. Irby's husband. I hope to see you in heaven someday, and when you show up, I will give you a big hug." He also said, "To all of my friends that stuck with me through all of these years, I am not going to say goodbye just saying so long. I am ready to go." At 6:39 p.m., he was pronounced dead, bringing an end to one of Texas's longest death row cases. John B. Nixon, Sr. John B. Nixon, Sr. was 77 years old when he became the oldest person executed in the U.S. since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. But his story wasn't one of youthful recklessness. It was a calculated murder-for-hire plot that sealed his fate. On January 22, 1985, Nixon and his sons John Jr. and Henry, along with an accomplice, Gilbert Jimenez, forced their way into the home of Virginia Tucker in Rankin County, Mississippi. Nixon was there to carry out a deadly mission. He had been paid $1,000 by Virginia's ex-husband, Elester Joseph Ponthieu, to kill her. Virginia and her husband, Thomas Tucker, were terrified, pleading for their lives. Thomas even offered Nixon money, hoping to buy their way out of death. But Nixon wasn't interested. "The deal's already been made," he coldly told them. Then he pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and shot Thomas in the head, but somehow Thomas survived and ran for help. Nixon then turned the gun on Virginia and shot her in the temple at point-blank range. She died the next day. Nixon was arrested later that year and sentenced to death in 1986. His execution was delayed for nearly 2 decades, but on December 14, 2005, he was finally put to death. His last meal? A T-bone steak, buttered asparagus, a baked potato, peach pie, and vanilla ice cream. His final words: "I did not kill Virginia Tucker. I know within my heart, and it hurts to acknowledge, that it was a son of mine and a Spanish friend and another man from Jackson." He claimed he had only taken the blame because he did not want to see his son end up where he was now. At 6 o'clock in the evening, John B. Nixon Sr. was pronounced dead. Clarence Ray Allen. Clarence Ray Allen spent more than 2 decades on death row, but his crimes had started long before that. Even behind bars, he remained a dangerous man, orchestrating deaths from a distance, determined to eliminate anyone who could testify against him. His story began in 1974, when he planned a burglary at Fran's Market in Fresno, California. He enlisted 2 men who worked for him at his security guard business, along with his son's girlfriend, Mary Sue Kitts. Everything seemed to go as planned until Mary made the mistake of confessing to Alan's son that it was Clarence himself who had organized the robbery. That single moment sealed her fate. Alan decided she had to be silenced. She was strangled to death, and her body was never found. It took 4 years for authorities to bring Alan to justice, and in 1978, he was sentenced to life in prison for burglary, first-degree murder, and conspiracy. But life behind bars didn't stop him. Instead of serving his time quietly, he became more ruthless. Determined to eliminate those who had testified against him, Alan befriended a fellow inmate, Billy Ray Hamilton, at Folsom State Prison. He manipulated Hamilton, feeding him plans for revenge and promising rewards. 3 days after Hamilton was released on parole, Alan's son picked him up from the bus station, handed him weapons, and sent him on his way. The mission was clear: kill those responsible for Alan's imprisonment. On September 4, 1980, Hamilton and his girlfriend, Connie Barbeau, walked into Fran's Market. They seemed like regular customers at first, purchasing meat from an employee named Joe Rios. But things quickly took a dark turn. Hamilton, armed with a sawed-off shotgun, forced Rios, Douglas White, Byron Schledowitz, and Josephine Rocha into the storeroom. He then dragged White to the freezer, demanding to know where the safes were. When White told him there were none, they returned to the others. Hamilton ordered Schledowitz to hand over the keys to the safe. While Barbeau stood guard, Hamilton followed Schledowitz to retrieve the money. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. Schledowitz had been shot at close range. Then, without hesitation, Hamilton turned his gun on White, blasting him in the chest and stomach. Rocha was next. Another gunshot echoed through the store. 3 people lay dead. Rios, the only survivor, managed to shield himself just in time, but his arm was badly wounded. Hamilton and Barbeau fled, thinking they had erased all witnesses. The plan might have worked if Hamilton hadn't been caught shortly after during a robbery in Modesto. When police searched his belongings, they found an address book with one name that stood out: Clarence Ray Allen. Investigators quickly made the connection between the murders, the previous burglary at Fran's Market, and Allen's relentless need for revenge. He was found guilty of 3 additional murders and, on December 2, 1982, was sentenced to death. For the next 23 years, Allen sat on San Quentin's death row. By the time of his execution, he was 76 years old, legally blind, diabetic, and suffered from a severe heart condition. His attorneys argued that executing an elderly man in poor health was cruel and unusual punishment, but the families of the victims had waited too long for justice. On January 17, 2006, at 12:20 in the morning, Allen was strapped to the gurney for lethal injection. He had already enjoyed his last meal: buffalo steak, Kentucky fried chicken, fried bread, sugar-free pecan pie, sugar-free black walnut ice cream, and whole milk. As the execution chamber filled with witnesses, Allen gave his final words. He spoke about how much he loved his family, his friends who had stood by him, and even his pen pals from Europe. He called out the name of an inmate he had been neighbors with for 20 years. Then he spoke his final sentence, a phrase believed to come from the Lakota people. "My last words will be, Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much. I love you all. Goodbye." 18 minutes later, Clarence Ray Allen was pronounced dead at 12:38 in the morning. James Barney Hubbard. Another aging inmate, 74-year-old James Barney Hubbard, met his fate in the execution chamber after spending nearly 3 decades on death row. His case was one of betrayal, deception, and brutal violence. Given a second chance at life, Hubbard repaid kindness with murder. His violent past stretched back to 1957, when he was convicted of second-degree murder for killing David Dockery. He claimed self-defense, but the court disagreed, sentencing him to 50 years in prison. After serving just 19, he was granted parole in 1976. That's when he found an unexpected ally, 62-year-old store owner Lillian Montgomery. She believed in redemption, sponsoring his release and even letting him live in her home in Tuscaloosa. But Montgomery's kindness cost her everything. Just 3 months later, on January 10, 1977, police received a call from Hubbard. He claimed Montgomery had shot herself during a night of drinking. But the evidence told a different story. She had been shot 3 times, in the face, head, and shoulder. Hubbard had stolen her gold and diamond wristwatch, along with $500 in cash and checks. Later that year, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and in October 1977, he was sentenced to death. For the next 27 years, he fought his execution. By the time his final day arrived, he was frail, suffering from cancer, hepatitis, and dementia. His lawyers argued that executing an old sick man was inhumane, but Alabama Governor Bob Riley disagreed, stating, "Justice has not been swift in this case, but justice must be delivered." On August 5, 2004, Hubbard ate his last meal: eggs, bacon, fried green tomatoes, pineapple slices, and a V8 juice. Witnesses, including his son, daughter, and Montgomery's family, watched as he was put to death by lethal injection. At 74, he became the oldest person executed in the United States in decades. Brandon Jones. At 72 years old, Brandon Jones became the oldest person executed in Georgia since the state reinstated the death penalty. But what made his case even more striking was that he had spent over 36 years on death row, longer than some of the prison guards had even been alive. His crime dated back to June 17, 1979. That night in Cobb County, Georgia, Jones and his accomplice, Van Roosevelt Solomon, broke into a Tenneco convenience store with the intent to rob it. But when they encountered Roger Tackett, the store manager, their plan turned deadly. Tackett was forced into a back room and shot to death. Both Jones and Solomon were arrested shortly after, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. By 1980, both men were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Solomon was executed in 1985, but Jones managed to delay his fate through a series of legal appeals. His attorneys argued that his sentence was unfair since Solomon had fired the fatal shot, but the courts disagreed. Decades passed, and Jones remained on death row until his final appeal was denied, sealing his fate. On the night of February 2, 2016, Jones made an unusual decision. He refused a special last meal. Instead, he ate the prison's standard dinner of chicken, rutabagas, turnip greens, dry white beans, cornbread, and fruit punch. As he was led into the execution chamber, Jones declined to make a final statement. No last words, no final message, only silence. At 11:37 p.m., the lethal injection was administered, and at 12:46 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Gary Alvord. The next inmate is quite unlike others on death row, not because of his crimes, but because of how he met his end. Gary Alvord wasn't executed by the state of Florida. Instead, he outlived multiple governors, endless legal battles, and even other death row inmates, only to die of natural causes after nearly 40 years on death row. His story begins long before his most infamous crime. In the early 1970s, Alvord was already a convicted rapist in Michigan when he managed to escape from a mental hospital. He fled to Florida, where on June 18, 1973, he committed a brutal triple homicide. Breaking into the Tampa home of Patricia Lorraine Young, he strangled her, her mother, and her daughter, 3 generations of women murdered in a single night. Captured soon after, Alvord was sentenced to death in 1974. But unlike other death row inmates, his execution never came. His attorneys argued that he suffered from severe schizophrenia and was mentally incompetent to be put to death. The courts agreed, and despite several death warrants being signed over the years, Alvord remained alive, housed in a maximum security psychiatric ward rather than facing execution. His case became a symbol of the flaws and delays in America's death penalty system. How could a man sentenced to die continue living for decades? In the end, it wasn't even a lethal injection that ended his life. It was a brain tumor. On May 19, 2013, Alvord died in his sleep at the age of 66. Nearly 4 decades after being sentenced to die, he became the longest-serving death row inmate in U.S. history to pass away from natural causes. James Ford, another oldest inmate that was sentenced to death, was executed recently in 2025. James Dennis Ford, a man whose crime shocked Florida, was put to death by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. His horrific betrayal of trust turned a simple fishing trip into a nightmare that left a young child orphaned. Back in April of 1997, Ford invited his co-worker, Gregory Malnery, along with Gregory's wife, Kimberly, and their 22-month-old daughter, on what seemed like a peaceful outing. But instead of a day by the water, Ford carried out a brutal attack. He shot Gregory in the back of the head, slit his throat, and savagely beat him. Kimberly, though injured, managed to strap her baby into the truck, desperately trying to protect her. But Ford came back. He raped, beat, and then executed Kimberly before leaving their toddler alone in the bloodied scene. It took 18 hours before a sod farm worker stumbled upon the horror. 2 lifeless bodies and a baby girl, covered in insect bites and her mother's blood. Ford tried to cover his tracks, claiming he had left the family alive to go hunting, but the evidence told a different story. His hands, face, and clothes were stained with blood. He bore fresh scratches, and his gun was linked to the crime. DNA evidence sealed his fate. By 1999, he was convicted and sentenced to death for the murders, sexual battery with a firearm, and child abuse. After more than 2 decades on death row, Ford met his end on February 13, 2025. For his last meal, he chose a comforting Southern spread: steak, macaroni and cheese, sweet potatoes, fried okra, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. As he lay strapped to the gurney, he spoke no final words, but he left a written note that read, "Hugs, prayer, love. God bless everyone." At 6:19 in the evening, after several minutes of heavy breathing, Ford fell still. His execution marked Florida's first of the year, closing the chapter on a crime that had haunted a family for nearly 3 decades. Corey Johnson. Corey Johnson, an inmate executed in his 50s, was put to death by lethal injection on January 14, 2021. He was convicted for the murders of 7 people during his involvement in the Richmond, Virginia drug trade in 1992. Johnson's crimes were particularly brutal, including the shooting of a rival drug dealer, the killing of a woman over a crack cocaine debt, and the execution of a man he suspected of assisting the police. At the age of 52, he became the 12th federal inmate executed during President Donald Trump's first term. His final words reflected a mix of remorse and unexpected humor. Johnson apologized to the families of his victims, acknowledging that he had been blind and stupid in his past decisions. He admitted he was looking for shortcuts while on the streets and emphasized that he was no longer the same person he had been. He also expressed gratitude to his family, his legal team, and the prison staff. However, in a moment of unexpected levity, he jokingly complained that his last meal had been incomplete. "The pizza and strawberry shakes were wonderful, but I didn't get the jelly-filled donuts that I ordered. What's with that? This should be fixed." Despite his attorney's efforts to halt the execution, arguing that Johnson had an intellectual disability that should have exempted him from the death penalty, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal, and he was executed at 11:34 p.m. His final words ended with a simple yet profound statement: "I am at peace." While most of these inmates are now 6 feet under, the question remains: did justice really prevail? Some of their crimes were brutal, senseless acts of violence, but does their execution truly balance the scales? What do you think? Did we miss someone? Do you believe all these cases deserve the ultimate punishment? Drop your thoughts below. We're reading every comment. If you love these deep dives and want to see more cases brought to light, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.